So I have the honor of getting to share today's conversation with Bishop Buddy. Bishop, thank you so much for being with us. It's fantastic to have you. Take the microphone. I feel like it's the sort of highest praise as a bishop that when you come to visit a parish, everybody wants to say hi so much that you don't even have time to take off your alb. And this is what it is to be loved as a bishop. So thank you for being here. So I told the bishop that we were reading The Great Divorce, and she said, oh, I haven't read that in years. I would love to discuss that with you. So we're going to sort of jump into the text. So very briefly, we had just a little review. So you have this Greek concept of Hades. Here we have this picture of Homer summoning the spirits out of Hades, this gray, blah, boring space. And of course, this is the word that we get in the New Testament the most for, which often gets translated as hell. So we talked a bit about the old Apostles' Creed. He descended into hell, it says. It's really his translation of Hades. So it's this gray, blah world of specters and shades. We have the bus driver who comes and invites everyone out of Hades. And now we'll just jump into our first chapter. So, very briefly, while our hero is on the bus, he meets this guy in a bowler hat. And on the bus he says, I'm not going on this trip for my health. As far as that goes, I don't think it would suit me up there. But if I can come back with some real commodities, anything you could really bite or drink or sit on, why at once you'd get a demand down in our town. I'd start a little business. I'd have something to sell. And so we've met all these ghosts who have these sort of like tapes in their head, and they can't get out of this cycle of just thinking about money, or thinking about lust, or thinking about revenge and anger, or thinking about... So we have this commodities broker from heaven to hell. And so he goes up into paradise, he goes up into this garden of the holy ones, and then we hear what happens to him in chapter 6. The amazing thing was that he succeeded. So he's trying to pick up an apple to bring it back to hell. When I remembered what the leaf had felt like, so our hero tries to pick up a leaf and it's way too hard for him to lift, it's utterly impossible. This guy in the bowler hat has picked up a whole tiny apple and it's astonishing. When I remembered what it had felt like when I tried to lift it, I could hardly help admiring this unhappy creature when I saw him rise staggering to his feet, actually holding the smallest of apples in his hand. He was lame from his hurts, and the weight bent him double. Yet even so, inch by inch, still availing himself of every scrap of cover, he set out on his Via Dolorosa to the bus, carrying his torture. What's a Via Dolorosa? The way of sorrows, the way of the cross. So, I don't want to put the bishop on the spot, but are there other apples in the Bible anywhere that you
In the Psalms?
In the Psalms. I'm thinking of Amos's basket of summer fruit, actually.
He made the apple of my eye. Yeah.
So I'll read one more text and then I'd love to hear your thoughts on all this. Fool, said the angel, put it down. You cannot take it back. There is not room for it in hell. Stay here and learn to eat such apples. The very leaves and blades of grass in the wood will delight to teach you. Whether the ghost heard it or not, I do not know. At any rate, after pausing for a few minutes, it braced itself anew for its agonies and continued with an even greater caution till I lost sight of it. So we have this ghost who wants to take this piece of heaven down to hell to sell it. And this angel who says, consume it. Like, rejoice in it. Stay in heaven. What do you make of all that? I'm going to ask a professional.
Well, first of all, as I said earlier, I was grateful to reread the entire book. And for me, this is one, just the sequential theming of how, as we come to the end of our life, however long we're given, we become more of who we are. And so there's a responsibility as we live to pay attention to the kind of person we're becoming. And I think it was in one of Brian McLaren's book where he said that the person we become actually determines how much of God we can experience. that we have a responsibility to cultivate within ourselves a capacity to receive more of God. Because otherwise God has less space to, God is infinite, of course, but there is this sense of our responsibility to become open to receive what God alone can give. And we hear here just another example of someone who came to the end of his life, holding on to all the things that were defining of his life when he was at some pinnacle of his self-understanding, right? And that include holding on to commodities, right? Because that was his world. So that was where my head went with him, and frankly with all of them, that sense of this cautionary tale for us who are still on this side of the Jordan, to be mindful of the people we're becoming, so that when we get to the place where it is in fact all surrender, we've practiced it enough to be able to recognize it when we're there.
Amen. If you go to 11:15, you'll hear a good sermon that involves this concept as well. To me, it's sort of interesting, this kind of, obviously it's not actually an apple in Genesis, but you may know all this, but St. Jerome translates it as apple because the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, in Latin, malum, apple, like malic acid, also sounds like malum, like something bad, so he's calling it like a bad fruit. So St. Jerome's little joke that then gets reproduced in every painting ever. But for the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, I think it's St. John of Damascus that says that tree was also made for Adam and Eve to eat of. So that they had to sort of grow into the maturity of kind of living in Eden, life in Eden, relationship with God. So they're being prepared to eat of that as well. But instead of receiving it, they take it. And it's such a different thing. And thinking about this idea of kind of growing into ourselves, like I spend so much time grasping for joy or feeling good or whatever, when God is actually holding all those things out. And I'm like, I don't want it your way. I want it through this Black Friday sale, I don't want it your way. I want it through judging this idiot over here. And so I'm constantly sort of trying to grasp this apple instead of just like receive peace, receive love, which is a drag.
Right. And not recognizing when you're totally out of your league, right? Right? Like this is a totally different world. And again, having some sense of what that feels like, and having our wits about us to know that we are utterly dependent upon someone or something else larger than we are in that time, which I think is what all of the solid people represent, right? They represent those who are trying to say to the ghosts, trust me on this one, your resources aren't helpful to you here. Right? It's something else. Right?
Thoughts on our commercial traveler? Please.
So I always thought that when you got there, you were there. And this is telling me now that you get there, but you're not there yet.
So Deborah's wonderful synopsis of a great, great mystery is I always thought that when you got there, you were there. But this is telling me when you're there, you're not totally there yet. Yeah, it's interesting. Bishop, am I right in thinking that in the Rite One funeral prayers, we have this idea of going from like glory to glory after death?
Strength to strength.
Strength to strength.
Yeah.
Yeah, what do you think of that?
Well, I was struck by and I forget which chapter it's in, but when our narrator is learning about the solid, I think it's in chapter 9 where he's like he's so forlorn, just trying to make sense of all of this, right? Just so forlorn. Why is this happening? Why aren't the solid people being more helpful, or how can this be? And there's this image of people, of the solid people actually coming back to this bus station to try to help people make their way. And he talks about those who are in the far off mountains, it's incredibly comforting to me in the sense of, when I was at my father-in-law's deathbed, and he knew he was dying, I knew he was dying, And he just said to me, Marianne, when I think of heaven, it just doesn't seem like a very appealing place to me. I just don't, he was sort of assigned, and I was like, yeah, well, I don't know. I think, I just don't think we can understand it. But what I was with that image of like, they're onto other things now. They're onto other things that are just way beyond our capacity to understand or to even imagine. And that there is some sort of progression of that in the eternal, I find comforting because it is, I know I'm not going to be I know I'm not going to be ready for that by when I die. So that sense of, but I hear you, that it hurts when they step on things. That was a little bit of a, now Lewis does say, don't take it literally, right? And he's really trying to tell us something about how we're living now, right? Giving us an allegory to help us live now by imagining ourselves in that ultimate transition.
Absolutely. It's wonderful. And then everyone is always talking about the coming of dawn. Like it's always a few minutes before dawn in heaven, and it's always a few minutes before twilight in hell. And so there is this sense that like, this is not the fullness of heaven, this is the valley of the shadow of life, one of the spirits tells him. And so they're waiting for this true dawn, which is the end of time, the last judgment, the resurrection of the dead, and the world to come. This Jewish concept of Olam Haba that we've been talking about, this idea of a completely new heaven, a completely new earth, a new creation. Chapter 7. It's all propaganda, it said. Of course there never was any question of our staying. You can't eat the fruit, you can't drink the water, and it takes all your time to walk on the grass. A human being couldn't live here. All that idea of staying is only an advertising stunt. And you've lived down in the town for some time? In what they call hell? Yes, it's a flop too. They lead you to expect red fire and devils and all sorts of interesting people sizzling on grids, Henry VIII and all that. Henry VIII. But when you get there, it's just like any other town. So, what do you think of this person who is so skeptical, so convinced that it's propaganda? He just kind of knows it all. This is an image from the painter Otto Dix, who was painting lots of sort of people in the lead up to World War II, the rise of fascism, and he just has these kind of horrific, monstrous portraits of people who are so sure of themselves. What do you think of the danger of that sureness?
Well, I recognize it, right? And the danger of becoming more and more like that, which eclipses our capacity for wonder and surprise. Right?
Yeah.
And again, it's there's nothing more depressing than. Of course, it's always so much easier to experience it in another person who is always coming at you with that kind of rejoinder. It's more humbling when you hear it coming out of your own mouth, right? And so just those times when you catch yourself, when I catch myself, sounding hardened, or when I hear that kind of hardened cynicism, right? It does shut us off from the joy of surprise, and also the horizons beyond what we ourselves know. Yeah.
I don't want to get too Lewis off topic, but we seem to be in a world in which people are like, everything is so bad.
Right.
You gotta fight fire with fire. These are inhuman people. They don't deserve to live. They don't deserve anything. And I'm not talking about a specific party or side. There's just hate going around like a wildfire. How do you see us as human beings not do that?
Well, what is the antidote to contempt? Because that's really what it is. It's contempt. And when we hold one another or the world or some part of the world in contempt, we are distancing ourselves and placing ourselves in a position of superiority or distance. And the only antidote to that is to strive to recognize the dignity and the worthiness of, while we're on this side of heaven, of every human being, and to strive to function out of that. And again, I commend to you Archbishop Hosam's letter yesterday, and you can get it on the internet. And he just says, as he's listing all the things that are happening, we refuse to hate anyone. We refuse to hate Iran. We refuse to hate Israelis. We just refuse to hate anyone. And that's a spiritual practice. I mean, it takes us out of how we might be feeling in a given moment to a place of, I choose this. And if I can't, I'm going to align myself as best I can with others who are doing it better than I can. You know what I mean? We're going to strive for it imperfectly. And that's, I mean, it's such a parody that we can see it. And I think Lewis's genius. That's what he's trying to do. Yeah.
It's interesting that not only is he this kind of skeptical, cynical person about the world, it's this level of kind of like knowing skepticism keeps him from even accepting just the gift of love, you know? He just doubts everything. It's all a scam, it's all fraud.
Yeah.
What a scary place to be.
What does this have to do with the preface that we started with, the marriage of Ellis and Hell?
Oh gosh, John Daniel always bringing the hard questions. What does this have to do with the preface, Blake's marriage of heaven and hell? That's a great question. I mean, I think in part, Lewis is sort of, he says, like, far be it for me to ever to try and create a rejoinder to someone as brilliant as William Blake. But I think Lewis does want to say, these are really separate phenomena. One is the fullness of reality, and the other is as close as you can get to non-being and nothingness while still having existence. And so I think there's this constant drive to kind of like pull us towards love and goodness and reality itself.
And he also, I think this is in chapter 9, but he talks about once, in retrospect, which I think is so interesting. In retrospect, he says, those who find themselves in heaven will have seen their entire life as on the road to heaven. Right?
Yeah, absolutely.
You know, so there is this sense that even the hard things will be, even the tragic things, everything will be seen through the prism of the destination. And we can identify with that once we've lived through something. We know how we experienced it in the moment and how we experienced it, how we remember it 20 years later, may be really different depending on how our lives evolved in that time frame.
Absolutely.
And so I think there is something about that all roads to heaven are heaven, and all roads to hell on some level are the same. Right?
Yeah.
I think he says that at some point, yeah.
Right on the screen.
Right there.
I'll back this up a tiny bit, but absolutely.
Can I just have a shout out for your rector here and what an amazing
Speaking of being embarrassed, chapter 8, shame. Go away, squealed the ghost. Go away. Can't you see I want to be alone? But you need help, said the solid one. If you have the least trace of decent feeling left, said the ghost, you keep away. I don't want help. I want to be left alone. Do go away. Then what is the matter? Can't you understand anything? Do you really suppose I'm going out there among all those people like this? How can I go about among a lot of people with real solid bodies? It's far worse than going out with nothing on would have been on earth. Have everyone staring through me. And I don't think this is primarily about aesthetics. So I once heard a rabbi say that when you get to the world to come, when you get to Olam Haba, or actually during the last judgment before Olam Haba, you will get up to heaven and everybody's going to be there. Everybody in the world, in the history of the world, is going to be there, and there's going to be a giant TV screen. And they're going to take one of those old VHS tapes, and they're going to put it in, and everybody's going to watch your entire life. Every dumb mistake you've ever made, every offensive thing you've ever said. But sometimes on the TV, it's just going to go, and it's going to be all static. And people are going to say, I wonder what happened then. And those are the parts of which you've already repented. But there is this sense that like in the light world to come, in heaven, just in the eyes of God, no secrets, you know? Like the College for Purity, you see it all. And sort of everyone is almost seen from this beatific perspective, like George MacDonald later says to our narrator, you know, you don't have to tell me all this stuff, I know it all about your life already, like that's clear to me. And so this ghost is feeling the shame at being seen. The ghost made a sound, something between a sob and a snarl. I wish I'd never been born, it said. What are we born for? For infinite happiness, said the spirit. You can step out into it at any moment. But I tell you, they'll see me. An hour hence, and you will not care. A day hence, and you will laugh at it. Don't you remember on earth, there were things too hot to touch with your fingers, but you could drink them all right? Shame is like that. If you will accept it, if you will drink the cup to the bottom, you will find it very nourishing. But try to do anything else with it, and it scalds. Now, I think that, sometimes we feel guilty for things, and we want to just bury them in the deepest, darkest cavern of the wine cellar of our hearts as far as possible, and never even admit to ourselves that they're there. But when we can sort of bring those up to God and actually say, I totally messed up. I really wish I hadn't done this. Please take this from me. Please help me. It can be so much new life. What do you make of this balance of where shame and repentance interact, and when it's awful and imprisoning, and when it's life-giving? What do you do with that, Bishop? All the easy questions.
Here's where I kind of distance myself from Lewis a bit. I appreciate him so much as a teacher. I feel, and he's leaning on things to make a point. And God knows I have many things of which I have rightfully to be ashamed. And the very experience that you're describing of having my failings brought to the light and not having it be a shameful thing, but actually liberating. But I think actually there's a lot of shame that is actually destructive to us. And that will be, I pray, taken from us as an unnecessary burden. And I talked a little bit this morning about false suffering, and it's actually imposed upon some of us. And I would appreciate that kind of nuance I don't expect it from C.S. Lewis, because that's not how he rolls in these books, which is totally Lewis, right? But I would just sort of step away and say, what do we know about shame now? And how might we add to the conversation? So that we have the rightful times when, and you see that, you see it in children sometimes. I remember with my kids, and I'm watching it now with my grandkids, when they do feel exposed, just totally exposed. And at times, and if they're young, they'll either lash out in anger or they will just burst into tears, right? And like the solid person, you just want to wrap your arms around the person and say, wrap your arms, this is going to be okay. But not necessarily ask them to take total responsibility for something that is way bigger than they are. So that's kind of where I am. I mean, like I said, if I were standing in his presence now, I would bow before C.S. Lewis. But there are some conversations I would have as well.
I love that. I often think of guilt and shame as the opposite of repentance. Yeah. I think repentance is being okay, I'm just a human, Yeah. I make silly mistakes all the time, and I want to try and change. And whereas shame and guilt are almost hanging on to that and carrying it around as this great weight.
Yeah, but again, I won't dwell on this, but it's assuming that all of it is your responsibility. It's all because of things that you did. And I'm just saying that the broken world we live in is way more complicated than that. And so if we're carrying around guilt and shame, some of it actually doesn't belong to us. Yeah. And I think that's all I'm trying to say.
That's super helpful.
Not to take away one shred of the guilt that does belong to us. And we're probably living far more of it than we are ever aware of. And some of it is a burden that we don't need to carry.
That's fantastic. Super helpful. We should write C.S. Lewis a letter. So this is George MacDonald. This is the guy that he meets. If you've never read his books, if you're like, I'm expecting this weighty tome of theology, they're largely sort of fantastical, fantasy, fairy tale, wonderful, kind of bizarre 19th century fictions. Have you read his stuff?
I have not.
I haven't read it all. I feel like I kept reading more and more, thinking like, when am I getting to this like deep theologian? And I was like, oh, there's another cool story about gnomes, you know? And they're really charming. I love them, but it's interesting that this guy is like C.S. Lewis's master.
Yeah.
And we'll maybe do a couple more minutes. And actually, since it's not every day you get to hang out with Bishop Buddy, even though we have a bunch more slides, maybe we'll tackle a lot of these next week. If folks have things that you'd like the bishop to comment on from this text, are there things we should talk about? Or we could just forge ahead with chapter 9, which is where all the theology is.
We should have a back.
Oh, please!
I'm interested in the connection between what you're just talking about with shame and not carrying things that belong to you, and the idea you talked about in the sermon of false suffering. And I don't know if that's too big of a thing to talk about right now, but
I think that's awesome.
So there's this concept in psychology, I think it was Carl Jung who first said it, that all neurosis is the result of avoidance of authentic suffering, right? So we take on a lot of suffering to avoid other things. So that's one aspect of suffering, right? We just struggle with things that anyway, so that's one. And then there was this other concept of a false cross. And a false cross being a cross that doesn't belong to you, right? So you're carrying something that doesn't belong to you. So those are two kind of philosophical, actually psychological concepts. And I would guess there's a relationship in there. I don't know that I would articulate it too firmly, because in my experience, when someone says to me, do you really need to be carrying what you're carrying right now? There's a part of me that just, like, it puts whatever that is in a different relationship. I'm just looking at, like, if I were thinking about this thing, what would I be thinking about? If I were free does this really belong to me? And those are really possibly liberating questions. Or it could be that there's a different kind of suffering that I'm avoiding as a result. And I'll just give you an example. It's not you to me. So it's a story that one of my mentors, Annie Willen, talked about in her, she was a psychiatrist and a theologian, and she said there was a woman who suffered a depression in her 40s, right? And she came to her psychiatrist because she was suffering from depression. And her parents, who were alive and in her life, the mother of the daughter, began to feel all the old guilt. Because as a child, there had been some real bad parenting choices that she had made that had caused her daughter real suffering at the time, right? And they had worked through it, and they had come through it, and they both, they went on, it would have been one of those static places in the TV that Bertie was talking about. And when her daughter as an adult was suffering from this depression, her mother fell into all that old guilt. And Ulanov said that was the false cross. Putting herself at the center of her adult daughter's depression, as opposed to letting her daughter have her own depression. Does that make sense? It's like, I'm going to take all of this on, and it was authentic and it was real, but it wasn't the real thing. The real thing was loving her adult daughter enough to care for her, but not place herself in the middle of that particular story, part of her story. That's the kind of, I don't know if that's shame, but it's that sense of having some distinction within ourselves about what it is we're feeling burdened by, right? And where God might invite us into a different understanding of what our place is. And so much of it is recognizing that we're not the center of every story.
Wait, what?
Shocking, but it is like, you know, it is just sadly true.
That's so helpful. I love that. It's awesome. Thank you. Anything else? Please.
Speaking of a broken world and not hating anyone, I've been thinking a lot about the Truth and Reconciliation communities in South Africa, and wondered if you could speak to how you have that reconciliation without justice, or where you can't even agree on what the truth is.
You probably can't have a truth and reconciliation conversation in that context. You have to wait until the environment allows for it. It doesn't mean you have to hate people, but it does recognize you can only, there are certain conversations that are only possible when people are ready and willing to have them. You know, Jesus forgave from the cross, saying, "Forgive them, they don't know what they're doing," and he did that. But it wasn't like he was having a reconciling conversation with the people who were mocking him on the cross. That wasn't the kind of forgiveness. So there's a different kind of reconciliation that the Truth and Reconciliation Committee was going for. And it was for justice, but it was a different kind of justice and a different kind of release. And we may have that in our future. I suspect that we will. And we have different kinds. I think the whole reparations conversation, quite honestly, is a truth and reconciliation kind of conversation. Are we willing to look at things that we have buried in our past because the consequences of them lived on even after we forgot that they happened, right? And that those are just, you know, we just have to be ready for them when those moments present themselves. Thank you for that.
One of the generally accepted truths of St. Albans is that our 11:15 starts at 11:15.
Okay?
And I don't want to incur the wrath of those waiting in the sanctuary.
Yes, well,
But
thank you.
before we go, can we have a big round of applause for our bishop?
And from the rector.
Thank you all.
Amazing to be with you. Thank you.